After the final gavel echoed and the courthouse emptied, a quiet breath of life remained in Courtroom 2A. The overhead lights had dimmed to their overnight glow, casting long shadows on the wooden benches and pale marble floors. Outside, the city of Birmingham wrapped itself in early winter, the sidewalks wet with a fresh drizzle, and the final city bus already pulling away from the courthouse stop. Inside, the only sound was the gentle squeak of wheels and the soft swish of a mop along the gallery floor. Rosa Mitchell pushed her cleaning cart along the aisle, humming something soft and nearly tuneless. She wasn't sure if it was a hymn her mother used to hum or just something she made up to keep her hands moving. The building was old, and the walls seemed to hold on to sounds longer than they should, like even silence echoed. She liked that. It made her feel less alone. Her mop glided smoothly over the polished surface, catching the faintest footprints, probably from a late attorney or one of the clerks forgetting a file. Rosa didn't mind. It was part of the job, and she did it well. She always had. For 9 years, she'd arrived just as everyone else was leaving. Her shift began when voices quieted and footsteps faded. By the time morning came, the courthouse would be spotless, just like it always was. She moved methodically, working the mop in a practiced rhythm, row by row, bench by bench. She paused briefly to pick up a crumpled coffee cup from the floor, hazelnut cream, judging by the faint scent. She smiled a little. Probably Mr. Livingston again. He always left his cups behind, always said he'd clean up one day, and never did. The smile faded as she glanced at her watch. The numbers blinked. 11:27 p.m. Her breath caught in her throat. She missed it. The last bus. She usually finished by 11:10, just enough time to rush outside, wave at the driver, and squeeze into the second-to-last seat. But tonight, she'd started late. The supplies closet needed restocking, and the elevator was down. Again. She exhaled, slow and resigned. She didn't panic. This wasn't the first time. But her legs ached more than usual tonight. She'd picked up an extra shift over the weekend to cover her cousin's hours. 2 courtrooms, 6 hallways, and a full jury room later. Her body was just done. She leaned her mop against the wall and rubbed her shoulder gently. The strap of her supply bag had dug a little too deep. She glanced around the room. Empty, still, safe. The long benches in the gallery looked almost inviting in the hush. Usually she didn't sit during her shift. It made her feel like she was stealing time. But tonight, her feet throbbed and her knees protested with every step. Maybe just a few minutes. She lowered herself slowly onto the second row and let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh. The wood was cold beneath her, but it didn't matter. She adjusted her name tag. It had flipped backward again, and let her head rest gently against the side panel of the bench. Her eyelids fluttered. Just 5 minutes, she told herself. 5 minutes to close her eyes, then she'd get back up and finish the east hallway. But the quiet was deeper than she expected, the weight of the day heavier. And before she could count to 20, Rosa Mitchell had slipped into sleep, the red handle of her mop still loosely gripped in her tired hands. Judge William Redmond was halfway to the courthouse door when he stopped. His hand hovered above the briefcase in his grip, and his brows furrowed. File. He'd left the case review file on the bench, the Simmons case. Not urgent, but tomorrow morning would be a mess without it. He sighed, turned on his heel, and retraced his steps. His polished shoes tapped a steady rhythm against the marble as he moved back through the empty corridors. The courtroom felt different at night. Quieter than he liked. During the day, it was full of motion, arguments, objections, verdicts. It gave him purpose, structure. At night, though, it became too still. It reminded him of things he'd rather forget. He opened the double doors to Courtroom 2A and stepped inside. The soft whir of the building's HVAC was the only sound. Then something made him stop mid-step. A shape, a figure. Someone was sitting, no, lying, on the second bench, deep in the gallery. At first he thought it might be a trespasser. His hand instinctively tightened around the leather strap of his briefcase. Then he saw the uniform, the soft blue fabric, the lopsided name badge, Rosa Mitchell. He blinked. He'd seen her before, of course, knew her name from the staff list, had passed her in the halls countless times, usually when he was leaving late. A polite nod, sometimes a thank you if she was cleaning his chambers. But he'd never seen her. Not like this. Her head rested against the paneling, her dark curls tucked under the edge of her cap. One arm cradled the mop like it was part of her. Her chest rose and fell gently. There was a smudge on her cheek, probably from the courtroom floor. Her shoes, he noticed now, were taped on the sides. Duct tape. The sole on the left had peeled almost clean off. She didn't stir. Redmond didn't move. He just stood there, taking in the scene. This was his courtroom, his domain. Every inch of it had felt familiar, even sacred. But now it felt different, like it belonged to someone else, someone whose presence he'd never honored. He didn't know how long he stood there, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 10. But for the first time in his 32 years on the bench, he felt something shift deep in his chest. Not guilt, not pity, shame. He looked around the room. The lights hummed overhead. The bench still held the echoes of the last gavel. The flag stood still in the corner, draped in ceremony. And at the heart of it all, the woman who had cleaned up after justice for nearly a decade, forgotten, invisible, was finally seen. Redmond exhaled, a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He didn't wake her. He didn't speak. He turned, walked back to his chambers in silence, and left the Simmons file where it was. He didn't need it tonight. He needed to think. He didn't call her name. He just stood there, watching. And something in him began to break. That night, Judge Redmond didn't sleep, not because of a case, but because of a question. He'd left the courthouse with his collar loosened and briefcase in hand, but his mind never made it home. The drive was quiet. No radio, just the sound of wet tires against the pavement and the faint hum of traffic lights changing for no one. His house greeted him like it always did, dim, tidy, impersonal. He poured himself a glass of water and set it down on the same coaster he'd used for years. The walls were lined with shelves of law books and old photographs. A younger version of himself smiled beside his late wife in one frame, her hand looped through his arm outside the same courthouse. Another showed him with his first clerk, back when he still believed every decision he made held the power to change the world. But tonight he didn't look at the pictures. He sat on the edge of his bed, robe draped over the nearby chair, and stared at his hands. He'd spent a lifetime handing down judgments, sentences, rulings, all clean, orderly, framed within statutes and precedent. But nothing about Rosa Mitchell sleeping on that bench felt clean or orderly. It felt like something he couldn't cite or file away. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and closed his eyes. For years, she had passed through his peripheral vision, a silent presence, mopping floors, wiping down benches, picking up the trail justice left behind. And not once had he asked her name out loud. Not once had he wondered how she got home, or if she had a warm meal waiting. He assumed she was okay, because that's what people do with the invisible. They assume. But now, the image wouldn't leave his mind. The duct tape on her shoes, the way her hand held the mop like it was part of her body, and the peaceful exhaustion carved into her sleeping face. His sleep came in short bursts, haunted by that courtroom bench. The next morning, Judge Redmond arrived earlier than usual. The courthouse was mostly empty, the halls still quiet. The security guard nodded in surprise as he entered. "Mornin', Judge. Everything all right?" Redmond simply nodded. "Just needed an early start." In his chambers, he closed the door behind him and sat at his desk. For a long time, he didn't touch the files in front of him. Instead, he opened the staff directory binder. It was old school. Paper, not digital. He liked things that way. Under Facilities Night Shift, her name appeared, Rosa Mitchell. Start date, October 2016. No sick leave logged in the past 2 years. Emergency contact, blank. He stared at the page longer than necessary. Then he opened his drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was the one he used for thoughts not meant for legal briefs. Quotes, ideas, things he didn't want to forget. He hadn't written in it in over a year. He uncapped his pen and at the top of a clean page wrote, "We failed to see her, and by doing so, we failed ourselves." He paused. Then he wrote more. Words came slowly at first, clunky, unsure. But the more he wrote, the more he realized this wasn't just about Rosa. It was about what the court had become, what he had become. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing people and started seeing roles. Defendant, plaintiff, bailiff, clerk, janitor. He handed out justice in defined categories, never questioning the silence between them. And Rosa's silence, her literal, sleeping silence, had been louder than any gavel he'd ever struck. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Carol, his longtime court clerk. She stepped in, holding a stack of folders. "Morning, Judge. Got the pre-trial motions for the Hastings case and the rescheduled mediation for tomorrow." He nodded and motioned for her to set them down. She hesitated. "You all right? You look tired." He offered a faint smile. "I'm thinking differently today, that's all." Carol arched an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Let me know if you need anything else." As she turned to leave, Redmond spoke again. "Do you remember Rosa Mitchell?" She paused. "The night janitor?" "Yes." Carol shrugged. "Sure. Quiet lady. Always polite." "Do you know how she gets home after her shift?" The question caught her off guard. I don't, actually. Never thought to ask." Redmond nodded slowly. "Neither did I." She lingered, unsure if this was the start of a conversation or the end of one. When he didn't say more, she slipped out quietly. Redmond stared down at his notebook again. He flipped to a clean page. At the top, he wrote her name, Rosa Mitchell. Then, in slow, deliberate pen strokes, he circled it. Once, twice, 3 times. The name looked different now, bolder somehow, like it carried weight. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He remembered his early days as a public defender, back when cases were messy and people didn't always fit neatly into files. He remembered his first pro bono win, the feeling of telling someone, "You're going home," and meaning it. Back then, justice had felt human. Now it felt procedural. He opened his eyes. Something had to change. Not a policy, not a memo. Something real, something that reached past the robes and titles. He picked up the notebook again and began drafting a speech, unofficial, off-record, and uncharacteristically personal. He didn't know what it would become yet. He just knew he couldn't ignore the woman sleeping on that bench. Not anymore. And tomorrow, in a courtroom full of lawyers, clerks, and citizens, he'd say her name out loud. He circled her name 3 times, Rosa Mitchell. Tomorrow, he'd say it out loud. That morning, no one expected court to begin with silence. The courtroom buzzed with the usual rhythm, clerk tapping keys, attorneys shuffling notes, a soft murmur from the gallery. The scent of fresh coffee still lingered from the break room down the hall. Outside, Birmingham was waking slowly, wrapped in low clouds and soft drizzle. Inside courtroom 2A, everything looked as it always had, polished, orderly, untouched. But something was different. Judge William Redmond stood behind the bench earlier than expected. His black robe was fastened perfectly, his tie precisely knotted. But there was a weight to him today. His usual hard-set mouth, the one that often barked "next case," was relaxed, thoughtful, even tender, though few in the room would have dared use the word. Clerk Carroll glanced toward him with a puzzled expression. Normally, Judge Redmond reviewed the docket before court. Today he hadn't touched it. He didn't raise his gavel. Instead, he rested his hands on the bench, palms flat, as if grounding himself. "I'd like to begin," he said, his voice steady but softer than most had ever heard, "by speaking about something not on our docket." A few attorneys looked up from their files. Others blinked, confused. Redmond didn't wait. "We often talk here about guilt, innocence, facts, and precedent. We cite law, argue details, and pursue justice, as if it's a puzzle to be solved. But this morning I ask your patience as I speak not of law, but of dignity." The room fell still. He glanced at the gallery, eyes settling not on any person, but on the second bench, the same bench where, just 2 nights ago, a woman had slept under fluorescent lights after missing her last bus home. "Her name," Redmond said, his voice more certain now, "is Rosa Mitchell." The typing stopped. Every pen paused. Every glance shifted. "Rosa Mitchell?" He nodded slowly. "For nearly a decade, she has cleaned this courtroom after hours. She arrives after the noise fades, when we've all gone home. She wipes our footprints from these floors, scrubs our spilled coffee, picks up the papers we leave behind in our rush to deliver justice." A quiet flush spread across a few cheeks in the room. One young prosecutor lowered his gaze. A public defender cleared her throat but said nothing. "Last night," Redmond continued, "I found her here, not cleaning, not working, sleeping. Not by choice, but because she'd worked 3 shifts back-to-back, missed the last bus, and didn't have enough money for a cab." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "And we, all of us, walked over her life, over her exhaustion, over her humanity, without ever asking her name." A deep discomfort rolled through the room, not outrage, not debate, just recognition. "If this court believes in justice," he said, voice firm now, "then it must begin not only with those who speak loudest, but those who are never heard." From the side hallway, Rosa stood just beyond view, still in her blue uniform. She hadn't expected to be called. Carol had told her Judge Redmond wanted to speak with her privately after the session, but now she heard her name, in public, on the record. She froze. Inside the courtroom, Redmond took a small breath. "I've requested her presence here today, not as staff, not as janitor, but as a guest." The side door opened. All eyes turned as Rosa stepped slowly into the room, mop still in hand. She hadn't known what to wear, so she wore her work. Her name badge sat slightly crooked on her chest, and the left shoe, still taped, pressed softly against the tile. The courtroom, accustomed to dramatic entrances, held its collective breath. She didn't make eye contact, not out of shame, but disbelief. Her fingers gripped the red mop handle out of habit. It grounded her in a room where she'd always been invisible. Redmond stepped down from the bench. He didn't speak as he walked to the center of the room, then turned back to face the court. "We cite precedent here. We honor witnesses and learned counsel. But today, I ask that we honor Ms. Rosa Mitchell for the quiet, unwavering devotion that none of us ever acknowledged." A few clerks began to stand, then a defense attorney, then 2 more, and slowly, without instruction, the entire courtroom rose to their feet. Rosa blinked, once, twice. Her hands trembled. No one had ever stood for her before. Redmond opened the manila folder he'd carried in. "By order of this court," he read, "Ms. Mitchell will receive a full benefits grant from the Judicial Service Foundation, including housing stipend, health coverage, and a transportation allowance. Effective immediately!" A small gasp rippled across the benches. He continued, "Furthermore, no courthouse under this district will schedule solo overnight cleaning shifts. All facilities will rotate multiple personnel, and cleaning operations will be included in quarterly staff reviews for acknowledgement." Rosa looked up, just briefly. It wasn't about the benefits or the new policy. It was that someone had finally noticed. Redmond stepped beside her. He didn't touch her shoulder, didn't make a scene. He simply stood there facing the courtroom as if this had always been her place, too. For the first time, Rosa looked up, and the room saw her. Word spread faster than a verdict. Rosa Mitchell had been honored in open court. By lunchtime, it wasn't just the clerks and bailiffs who whispered about what had happened in courtroom 2A. It was the receptionists, the parking attendants, the IT guys in the basement, who usually didn't care about anything outside their server room. Even the woman who ran the snack kiosk on the first floor had heard. She was the one who gave Rosa a free granola bar that afternoon, with a wink and a, "Heard you're kind of famous now." Rosa didn't quite know what to do with any of it. She still came in at the same time, 6 p.m. sharp, with her mop cart freshly restocked. She still wore the same blue uniform, still used the service elevator that rattled like it needed retirement. But now, people looked up when she walked by. They didn't just move their feet to let her pass. They said hello. They used her name. "Evening, Ms. Mitchell," one of the young defense attorneys said as she passed him in the hallway. She almost didn't respond, thinking he was talking to someone else. No one had called her that in the building before. Most people just said ma'am, miss, or didn't say anything at all. But now it was like her name had been unmuted. Even stranger, she'd been asked to attend a staff meeting. It wasn't mandatory, not for cleaning staff, but the note had come from the judge's office himself, a sticky note on her locker door in neat handwriting. "If you're willing, we'd value your insight. 4:30 p.m., Courtroom B." She arrived early, unsure if she should knock or just walk in. She'd never been in one of the administrative conference rooms before. The carpet was softer, and there was a coffee pot in the corner that wasn't coin-operated. Inside, a half-dozen people from different departments sat around the table. A clerk from HR, a scheduling supervisor, 2 maintenance leads, and seated quietly at the head of the table was Judge Redmond. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, rising as she entered. "Thank you for coming." She paused in the doorway. "I'm not used to meetings." He smiled gently. "We're not used to inviting the right people. Please have a seat." They talked for nearly an hour. Not about policy, not about performance metrics, but about experience. Rosa shared how single night shifts often led to dangerous situations. Women alone in dark buildings, cleaning multiple floors while security slept. She mentioned the outdated lighting near the rear stairwells, the supply closets without proper ventilation, the long walks to the nearest restroom on the top floor, and the room listened. Not just politely, actively. They took notes, asked questions, didn't interrupt. When the meeting ended, Redmond thanked her again and said, "I'd like for you to join the facility's advisory rotation. Monthly meetings. Your voice deserves to be part of the decisions." She hesitated. "I don't have fancy words." "You have the truth," he replied. "That's more than most." Over the next few weeks, small things began to change. The bulletin board in the janitorial break room got updated. Rosa's name was listed under Advisory Liaison. The vending machines were replaced with newer models that actually took cards, and the maintenance crew started staggering their shifts, ensuring no one worked a full night alone anymore. Rosa's locker was cleaned and repainted. No more rust on the hinges. Someone had even put a magnetic whiteboard on the door with the words, "Ms. Mitchell's Corner," in blue marker. She didn't ask for any of it. In truth, she wasn't sure how to feel about it. The attention made her uneasy at times. She was used to blending in, not standing out. But the feeling of being noticed, not for doing something heroic or dramatic, but just for doing her job with dignity, was something she carried with quiet pride. On a Tuesday afternoon, while wiping down the inside glass of Courtroom 3B, she heard footsteps approach behind her. "Ms. Mitchell?" She turned. It was Olivia Parson, one of the youngest clerks in the building. Rosa remembered her mostly by the sound of her high heels and how she always typed too loudly. "I was wondering," Olivia said, hesitating a little, "could you show me how you keep the benches from streaking? Mine always look cloudy when I clean them." Rosa blinked. It wasn't a sarcastic request. Olivia was holding a spray bottle and a rag. She looked earnest, a little embarrassed even. Rosa nodded. "Sure, it's the cloth mostly. Use microfiber. The old cotton ones leave fibers behind, and you wipe in small circles, not lines." They spent 15 quiet minutes working side by side, their reflections faint in the polished wood. When they finished, Olivia said, "Thanks, you make it look easy. "It's just time," Rosa replied, "and caring enough to get it right." The young woman smiled and left. Rosa watched her go, then looked back at the bench. She hadn't realized how many people had been watching her all these years without really seeing her. At home, things stayed mostly the same. Her apartment was still on the second floor of an old brick building near the bus depot. The heat still rattled in the walls when it came on, and the window in the kitchen still needed propping open with a spoon handle. But her nights felt different. She walked into work standing just a little taller. When she passed people in the hallway, she didn't look down first. Even the way she mopped had shifted, not in technique, but in feeling. It no longer felt like cleaning up after others. It felt like preserving something important. One Friday evening, she arrived to find a folded paper taped to her cart. It was hand-drawn, in marker. A cartoon of a superhero in a blue uniform, holding a mop like a sword. The caption read, "Our real MVP, Ms. Mitchell." She chuckled. At the bottom corner was a small note in messy cursive. "Thank you for keeping us steady. B, the night clerk with the coke addiction." She tucked the drawing into her bag. She wouldn't hang it up. That wasn't her style, but she'd keep it. On the first day of spring, Judge Redmond called her into chambers again. She walked in with her uniform freshly ironed, her shoes, finally new, quiet against the hardwood. "I have a favor to ask," he said, gesturing for her to sit. She did. "We're planning a facilities appreciation week. I'd like you to speak on behalf of your team." Rosa froze. "Speak?" He nodded. "Just a few words. About your experience, what the work means to you." She shook her head gently. "I'm not a speaker, Judge." "You're a witness," he replied, "and sometimes that's all a courtroom really needs." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "All right, but I won't say anything fancy." He smiled. "We don't need fancy. We just need you." She wasn't just cleaning the courthouse anymore. She was shaping it. They said it started with a mop. It ended with a plaque. But Rosa Mitchell knew better. It didn't start with cleaning, and it didn't end with applause or policies or meetings. For her, it started long before any courtroom noticed, on quiet nights, under fluorescent lights, when she pushed her cart down empty corridors and hummed just to feel a little less alone. And now, people wanted to commemorate it. She wasn't sure how to feel. It had been Judge Redmond's idea, quietly brought up during one of their monthly advisory meetings. "I think we should mark the bench," he said one afternoon, his fingers laced in front of him. Not with a spotlight, just a small plaque, something that lasts. He didn't say her name in that moment, but he didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood. The second bench in Courtroom 2A had become more than wood and polish. It had become part of something unspoken. At first, Rosa politely refused. "It's too much," she'd said. "I was just tired." But the others, staff who now saw her not as background but as compass, spoke gently, firmly. "You weren't just tired," said Helen from HR. "You were exhausted from keeping this place standing." "It's not a gift," added Carol. "It's acknowledgement." So she relented with one condition. "I choose the words." The day they installed the plaque, the courthouse was mostly empty. Judge Redmond had arranged it to be that way. No press, no photographers, no fanfare. Just a handful of people who mattered. The clerk who always said thank you now, the IT tech who brought her donuts on Fridays, and the intern who once asked how to clean a scuff mark off polished tile. They gathered quietly in Courtroom 2A, dressed in work clothes, not ceremony. The second bench sat as it always had, humble, unassuming. On the armrest, Maintenance Supervisor Tom used a small electric drill to secure a thin piece of brass no larger than a paperback. The screws clicked gently into the wood. When he finished, he stepped back, and they all leaned in. The plaque read, "She cleaned what we left behind and showed us what we forgot to see. No name, just truth." Rosa stood at a small distance. She didn't need to touch it. The bench wasn't hers. It belonged to the building, to the silence, to the memory of that night and everything that followed. But as she looked at the plaque, something shifted inside her. Something that had been tight for years finally let go. She hadn't even known it was there, clenched deep in her chest. That feeling of being unseen, like the world moved around her but never noticed her feet. Now the room felt different, not because of the metal, but because of the people standing beside it. "Would you like to say anything?" Judge Redmond asked gently. She shook her head. "Not today." He nodded. He understood. Later that afternoon, Rosa returned to her usual rounds. She emptied waste bins, wiped down door handles, swept the break room floor. Her body moved with familiar rhythm, but every now and then her eyes drifted back to the small brass plaque. Not with pride, not with ego, just peace. That night, a young intern named Jacob passed by the courtroom. He noticed the plaque and paused. He stared for a moment, then turned to the man standing near the back, Judge Redmond, sipping cold coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Sir," Jacob asked, "why that bench?" Redmond didn't answer right away. He walked over, stood beside the intern, and looked at the brass rectangle that shimmered faintly in the hallway light. Then he said, "Because that's where I finally learned the right question." Jacob tilted his head. "What question?" Redmond smiled, not the proud, smug kind, a small, knowing smile. "Who keeps this place alive when no one's watching?" The plaque became part of the building's quiet story. Visitors sometimes missed it. Judges from other districts passed it without noticing. But janitors, clerks, and interns stopped. Some touched it softly with their fingertips. Others just stared. No one needed to explain it anymore. At Rosa's apartment, the drawing from the night clerk still hung on the fridge. Her shoes, now replaced with sturdy, slip-resistant soles, sat neatly by the door. And tucked inside her bedside drawer was the original scrap of paper where she'd scribbled the words now carved in brass. She looked at it sometimes, not because she forgot, but to remember gently. The courthouse hadn't made her important. It had finally admitted that she always was. Months passed. Rosa never gave an interview, but the courtroom never forgot. No reporters had been allowed in that day. No official press release was issued. Still, the story moved, not like a headline, but like a hush, passed in break-room whispers, in hallway nods, in the pause before someone left a coffee cup behind. The bench with the brass plaque became something like a compass. People slowed down when they passed it. Some touched it lightly, like it carried weight. Some just looked at it, then looked at themselves. Rosa Mitchell never changed her schedule. She still arrived a few minutes early, still brought her own thermos with mint tea, still wore her name tag slightly tilted even after getting new uniforms. But something in her posture shifted, subtle. She didn't curl inward anymore. Her shoulders rolled back. Her eyes stayed level when she walked into a room, and wherever she walked, people straightened up a little. Judge Redmond made it a ritual. Once a month, usually in the early evening, he'd walk the courthouse halls after hours, not to inspect, not to monitor, just to remember. He nodded to the janitors, the night clerks, the ones who worked quietly behind the silence. He stopped by Rosa's office, now just off the main hallway, small, simple, with a clean desk and a calendar she actually used. "Evening, Judge," she'd say, without looking up from her clipboard. "Evening, Ms. Mitchell," he'd reply with a faint smile. Their conversations were brief, comfortable, like old neighbors who no longer needed small talk. One evening, while walking with a new intern named Lily, Redmond paused in front of the plaque. The girl tilted her head and read the engraving aloud. "She cleaned what we left behind and showed us what we forgot to see." Lily turned. "Is that real?" Redmond glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Like, did that really happen?" He didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to the bench, ran his fingertips along the smooth brass, and exhaled. "Yes," he said, "and it's still happening." The courthouse evolved, slowly and quietly. It wasn't just about Rosa. It was about the space around her. Cleaning schedules were updated. Facilities staff were invited to annual meetings. Coffee and snacks were stocked in the break room without being locked behind glass. Ms. Mitchell became more than a name. It became a kind of standard. People started saying, "Thank you" more. People started seeing. Rosa's role changed too. Not in title. She still called herself a janitor, even though her badge now read head of courthouse facilities. But in function, she helped onboard new staff, gave small presentations on safety procedures, taught a junior clerk how to fix the paper jam in the old third-floor copier that no one else dared touch. Once she walked past a group of young law students touring the courthouse. One of them whispered, "That's her," and straightened his blazer. She pretended not to notice. But later that night, when she was alone in the stairwell, she allowed herself a small smile. She never asked for respect. She'd only ever wanted to be treated like she mattered. And now she was. On a Tuesday afternoon in early summer, Rosa sat on the bench. The bench. It was the first time she'd done so since that night. She didn't sit out of exhaustion. She wasn't waiting for a ride. She wasn't hiding from anything. She just needed a moment. The courtroom was empty, quiet. The sunlight from the high windows painted gold across the floor. Her mop cart sat nearby, untouched. She looked at the brass plaque. Her own words, chosen months ago, still rang true. She cleaned what they left behind and showed them what they forgot to see. Not justice, not law, not rules, but people. She sat there for a while, her hands folded gently in her lap, and thought about nothing and everything. About her mother, who used to clean school buildings and never once got a thank you. About the nights she walked home in the rain. About the day someone finally said her name like it meant something. She didn't need applause. She didn't need more plaques. But she needed this moment. And when she finally stood, a voice behind her called out, not loud, not urgent. "Ms. Mitchell?" She turned. It was one of the clerks, a new one, nervous, holding a stack of papers. "Yes?" The young man smiled. "Just wanted to say, we appreciate you." She nodded. "Thank you." She walked away, the plaque at her back, the courthouse alive around her. She never bragged, never gave interviews. She declined every podcast, every feature story. "I didn't change anything," she'd say. "He did. He just needed to see." But those who watched, those who paid attention, knew better. She changed everything. Not with noise, with presence, with consistency, with quiet truth. And that, in the end, was the verdict that mattered most. Long after the applause faded and the courthouse resumed its rhythm, the story of Rosa Mitchell lingered. Not because she sought attention or claimed to be a symbol, but because she reminded people of something they'd forgotten, that real justice doesn't always stand behind a bench or wear a robe. Sometimes it walks quietly through a courtroom after hours, mop in hand, asking for nothing but dignity. In many ways, Rosa's journey spoke to something larger, a truth the Black community has long carried. That respect is not always granted, even when earned. That too often, the ones holding institutions together from the bottom go unseen. Rosa didn't march or shout. She simply showed up, every night, for nearly a decade, doing the work others stepped over. And in that quiet, she taught an entire building how to see again. Her bench, the one where exhaustion claimed her and change began, became more than a seat. It became a question, a reminder, a moment of reckoning. For the Black community, especially for Black women in service roles, her story felt deeply familiar. Being present, essential, and yet invisible. Until one day, someone finally looks, really looks. The lesson is not in grand gestures, but in consistent decency. Rosa's victory wasn't a legal one. It was human. She didn't demand recognition. But when it came, she stood with grace, showing the strength so many in the Black community have always embodied: patience, endurance, and quiet conviction. Like a soft light in a hallway long ignored, Rosa's presence didn't scream. It's simply illuminated. And that light has a way of spreading. Take a moment to reflect, not just on Rosa, but on the people in your own world who go unseen. The ones who pick up after the noise fades, who keep the spaces clean, safe, and whole. Justice isn't just what happens in courtrooms. It's how we treat each other when no one's looking. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it. Not for attention, but for awareness. Somewhere, someone like Rosa is still sweeping in silence, waiting not for applause, but for acknowledgement. Because in the end, real justice lives in the quietest places.